HOA. Members used my barn for free parking. I made them regret it. First, some background. I live on a 5-acre property at the edge of a suburban development in Colorado. My place used to be part of an old farm that got parceled out when the original owner passed away about 15 years ago. Most of the farmland was developed into cookie-cutter houses with tiny yards, but I managed to snag the portion with the original farmhouse and barn. The barn's in great shape. Previous owner maintained it well, and I use it to store my restored classic cars and workshop equipment. The development next door has one of those typical controlling H.O.A.s. You know the type. They measure your grass with a ruler and send nastygrams if your mailbox is the wrong shade of beige. I specifically bought my property because it wasn't part of their HOA. I like my freedom, thank you very much. Everything was fine for the first few years. The HOA folks mostly ignored me, and I ignored them. Sure, I got some side-eye for having a project car in my driveway occasionally, but they couldn't do anything about it. That all changed when they decided to host their annual summer block party. I was away on a business trip that weekend. When I got back, I noticed tire tracks in my gravel driveway leading to my barn. Weird, I thought, but didn't think much of it. Then it happened again the next weekend, and the weekend after that. Finally, one Saturday morning, I decided to investigate. I set up my trail camera, originally bought to catch whoever was stealing my mail last year, near the barn entrance. What I discovered made my blood boil. The HOA board members had been telling residents they could park in my barn during their weekend events. They actually had the nerve to use my private property as their overflow parking lot without even asking. The camera footage showed cars pulling in and out like it was a public garage. I confronted Sophia Mitchell, the HOA president, a real piece of work, who lived in the McMansion closest to my property. The conversation went exactly as well as you'd expect. Sophia, we need to talk about people parking in my barn. She had the audacity to look annoyed. Oh, that old thing? We figured since you barely use it, it would be perfect for guest parking during our community events. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. You figured? That's my private property. You can't just use it without permission. Well, she sniffed, adjusting her designer sunglasses. It's been sitting there empty most of the time. We're just being practical. Besides, it improves the neighborhood's property values by keeping cars off the street. I don't care about your property values. Stop using my barn as a parking lot or I'll take legal action. She actually laughed. Legal action? Don't be dramatic. We're just being neighborly. If you were a team player, you'd understand the importance of community spirit. That's when I realized talking wasn't going to solve this. Time for action. First step, documentation. I gathered all the camera footage showing cars entering and leaving my property. I identified license plates and matched them to HOA board members and residents. Then I called my lawyer, Jim Henderson, who'd helped me with property matters before. Jim, I've got an interesting situation here, I explained, showing him the footage. He whistled. Well, they're clearly trespassing. And if they're charging for parking or representing your property as HOA property, that's another legal issue entirely. What are my options? Several. We can start with a cease and desist letter. If they ignore that, we can file for an injunction and sue for damages. Plus, since they're using your property for parking without permission, we could potentially go after them for conversion. That's basically civil theft. Let's do it all, I said. These people need to learn they can't just take whatever they want. Jim drafted a strongly worded cease and desist letter detailing the legal consequences if they continued using my property. I had it delivered to each HOA board member personally. Their response? They ignored it completely. The next weekend, more cars in my barn. Time for phase 2 of my plan. I installed security cameras with better night vision and motion detection. I put up no trespassing signs everywhere, making sure to document their placement. I also installed a heavy-duty gate across my driveway, but I left it open, for now. Then I waited for their next big event, the HOA's annual Halloween party. The day before the party, I set my trap. First, I parked my own vehicles strategically in the barn, leaving just enough space to tempt a few more cars in. Then I installed temporary speed bumps, the really tall kind, just inside the barn entrance, but hidden in the shadows where they weren't easily visible when driving in. I also made sure to document everything with timestamps and photographs, showing that all my additions were clearly on my property and that appropriate warning signs were posted. The next evening, right on schedule, the cars started arriving. I watched through my security cameras as the first BMW pulled in, probably belonging to Karen from the HOA board. Crunch! The sound of her front bumper scraping the speed bump was music to my ears. More cars followed, each meeting the same fate. Some backed out immediately, but others, probably worried about being late to the party, proceeded anyway. By the end of the night, I had footage of 12 different vehicles damaging their undercarriages on my perfectly legal speed bumps. The next morning, Sophia was pounding on my door bright and early. "You damaged our cars," she screamed. "The HOA will sue you for this." I smiled calmly. "I installed security measures on my private property, which you were illegally trespassing on despite written warnings. But please, go ahead and sue me. I'm sure your insurance companies would love to hear why you were parking on private property without permission. You did this on purpose." I protected my property from trespassers. Everything I did was legal and documented. Now, would you like to discuss compensation for the months you've been using my property without permission, or should we let our lawyers handle it? She stormed off, but I knew this wasn't over. Sure enough, 2 days later, I received notice that the HOA was suing me for damages to their vehicles. Perfect! My lawyer was practically gleeful when I told him. They actually filed suit? This is going to be fun. We filed a countersuit immediately. The list of charges was beautiful. Trespassing, conversion, unauthorized use of private property, unjust enrichment, they'd been charging for parking at their events, conspiracy, the HOA board had knowingly orchestrated the whole thing, defamation, they'd been telling residents I'd agreed to this arrangement. The discovery phase was enlightening. We found emails between board members discussing how they could utilize the old barn for parking, without asking me because I'd probably say no anyway. There were even messages debating whether they could claim adverse possession of my property if they used it long enough. The court date was set for 3 months later. In the meantime, I installed cameras covering every angle of my property and kept the gate closed. I also started getting threatening letters from some HOA members, which I happily added to my evidence file. The day of the trial was better than I could have imagined. The HOA's lawyer tried to argue that I had created an attractive nuisance and that the speed bumps were an intentional trap. My lawyer destroyed that argument with photos of all the warning signs and documentation showing their premeditated trespassing. The judge was not amused by the HOA's actions. Her comment to their lawyer was priceless. "Let me make sure I understand this correctly. Your clients repeatedly trespassed on clearly marked private property, used it for their own profit, ignored a cease and desist letter, and are now suing the property owner because their vehicles were damaged while trespassing. Am I missing anything?" The HOA's lawyer actually stuttered. It was beautiful. The judge's ruling was even better. Not only was their suit dismissed, but my countersuit was successful. The HOA was ordered to pay $50,000 in compensatory damages for unauthorized use of my property, $25,000 for legal fees, $100,000 in punitive damages. Plus, individual board members were personally fined $5,000 each for conspiracy. The judge also issued a permanent injunction barring any HOA member from entering my property without written permission. But the best part? The HOA had to send a formal written apology to all residents, explaining that they had illegally used my property and lied about having permission. They also had to admit they had charged parking fees for property they didn't own or have rights to use. The aftermath was spectacular. 3 board members, including Sophia, were forced to resign due to the scandal. The HOA's insurance rates skyrocketed because of the lawsuit, leading to an increase in HOA fees. Several residents who had their cars damaged tried to sue the HOA board members personally for misleading them about having permission to park in my barn. I used part of the settlement money to install an even better security system and build a proper electronic gate. The rest I donated to a local legal aid organization that helps people fight predatory H.O.A.s. These days, the HOA keeps their distance. No more complaints about my project cars, no more passive-aggressive notes about my lawn care choices. Funny how a six-figure judgment changes people's attitudes about being neighborly. Sophia put her house up for sale last month. I heard through the grapevine that she's moving to a condo downtown. No HOA this time. Can't imagine why. As for my barn, it's still home to my classic car collection, but now it's also where I host monthly meetings for a local property rights advocacy group. We've helped several other homeowners stand up to overreaching H.O.A.s in the area. The best part is that every time I drive past the development's community center, I see cars parked everywhere along the street during their events. They finally had to lease proper parking space from a nearby church. Imagine that, actually paying for the property they use. I learned a few valuable lessons from this experience. Document everything, even if it seems minor at the time. 2. Invest in good security cameras. 3. Don't try to reason with unreasonable people. Or, a good lawyer is worth their weight in gold. 5. Sometimes the best revenge is letting people face the natural consequences of their actions. For those wondering about the legality of the speed bumps, my lawyer assured me they were perfectly legal since they were on private property. Warning signs were clearly posted. They were a reasonable security measure to prevent unauthorized vehicle access. Their installation was thoroughly documented. They weren't designed to cause damage, just to discourage trespassing. The judge agreed, noting that any damage was a result of the drivers choosing to proceed despite warnings and visible obstacles. I still can't believe they thought they could just help themselves to my property because it was convenient for them. The entitlement of some people is truly astounding. But I suppose I should thank them. Their actions led to me making some great connections in the property rights community, and the settlement paid for a beautiful restoration on my '67 Mustang. These days, when I see new neighbors moving into the development, I make sure to introduce myself and casually mention the great parking lawsuit of 2024. Word spreads fast, and I haven't had a single trespassing issue since. Sometimes I see Sophia's replacement on the HOA board eyeing my property during their events, but one meaningful glance at my security cameras is usually enough to remind them of the expensive lesson their predecessors learned. The moral of the story? Don't mess with other people's property, and definitely don't assume you can get away with it just because you're part of an HOA board. Karma has a way of catching up, and sometimes karma comes with a really good lawyer. Oh, and those speed bumps? They're still there, though they haven't claimed any victims lately. I think of them as modern art installations now. Monuments to the day entitled, "Neighbors Learned That Community Spirit Doesn't Override Property Rights." I've since added a large sign at my driveway entrance that reads, "Private property, not your parking lot. Yes, this means you, HOA." Some might call it petty, but I prefer to think of it as educational. After all, I'm just being neighborly by helping them avoid another expensive lesson in property law. The whole experience has actually made me appreciate my property even more. There's something satisfying about standing up to bullies, especially when they hide behind the facade of community standards and property values. My barn might be old, but it's mine, and now everyone in the neighborhood knows exactly what happens when they forget that fact. As I sit here in my workshop, tinkering with my latest restoration project, I can't help but smile when I hear the occasional car slow down near my driveway during HOA events, only to quickly drive away. The word has spread far and wide. Mess with the barn guy at your own risk. And Sophia? Last I heard, she's telling anyone who'll listen about the unreasonable neighbor who ruined her time on the HOA board. Somehow she always forgets to mention the part about organizing systematic trespassing and trying to steal my property. Funny how selective memory works, isn't it? But hey, at least she learned an important lesson about property rights. Sometimes the most expensive education is the one that sticks with you the longest. As for me, I'm just happy to have my barn back to myself, my security system running smoothly, and the satisfaction of knowing that sometimes justice comes with a really satisfying crunch of a BMW's undercarriage. Update. It's been 6 months since my last post, and a lot has happened. I figured you all might want to hear how things turned out after the great HOA parking scandal. Remember how I mentioned Sophia put her house up for sale? Well, she couldn't sell it. Turns out when potential buyers Googled the neighborhood, they found news articles about the lawsuit. Local real estate blogs had picked up the story as a warning about HOA overreach. Not great for property values, I guess. But Sophia wasn't done causing trouble. She tried one last desperate move before finally giving up and moving away. About 2 months after the lawsuit, she and a few other former board members filed an appeal, claiming the judge was biased against H.O.A.s. and that the punitive damages were excessive. My lawyer Jim called me as soon as he got the notice. They really don't know when to quit, do they? Guess not, I said. What are our chances? Better than good. The judge followed state precedent for punitive damages in property rights cases. Plus, we have all their emails showing malicious intent. They're just wasting more money. He was right. The appeal hearing was almost funny. Their new lawyer tried to argue that they had implied permission to use my barn because I hadn't immediately stopped them. The appeals judge shut that down fast. Counsel, he said, are you suggesting that failure to immediately detect and stop trespassing grants permission for that trespassing to continue indefinitely? Their lawyer stumbled. Well, Your Honor, there was a community benefit. A community benefit to using someone else's private property without permission or compensation. Please explain how that's different from theft. He couldn't. The appeal was denied, and they were ordered to pay our additional legal fees. Another $15,000 down the drain for them. But here's where it gets interesting. During the appeal process, we discovered something that blew the case wide open. Remember how they were charging for parking during their events? Turns out those payments weren't being properly reported to the HOA's accountant. 3 years of cash payments for parking had mysteriously vanished from the books. The HOA's insurance company, already unhappy about paying out for the original lawsuit, launched their own investigation. They found that Sophia and 2 other board members had been pocketing the parking fees instead of putting them into the HOA's account. We're talking about thousands of dollars in unreported cash. The insurance company immediately filed suit against them for fraud. Several homeowners also filed a class action lawsuit, demanding repayment of all parking fees plus interest. The district attorney's office even got involved, investigating possible criminal charges for embezzlement. Sophia tried to blame it on poor record-keeping, but the evidence was pretty clear. They had email threads discussing how to handle the cash without creating a paper trail. Real amateur hour stuff. Last month, she and the other 2 board members agreed to a plea deal. They have to repay all the parking fees plus interest, perform community service, and they're banned from serving on any HOA board in the state. Sophia also had to pay a hefty fine to avoid criminal charges. The fallout has been massive. The entire HOA has been restructured. The new board actually seems reasonable. They hired a professional management company to handle the finances and brought in an independent auditor to review everything. They even passed new bylaws requiring all board decisions about property use to be approved by a homeowner vote. The new board president, Henry Taylor, came over to apologize in person. He seemed like a genuine guy. "What happened to you was completely unacceptable," he said. "We're making sure nothing like this can ever happen again." We had a good conversation about property rights and community relations. He even asked for advice about finding legitimate parking solutions for their events. I suggested they look into the empty lot behind the shopping center a quarter mile away. The owner's been trying to lease it out. You could probably get a good deal on event parking. They followed up on that idea and now have a proper parking agreement with the lot owner. They even installed shuttle service for elderly residents during big events. Amazing what people can accomplish when they actually work within the law. The story made the rounds in property rights circles. I've been asked to speak at several homeowners' rights conferences. My lawyer Jim and I put together a presentation about documenting property violations and standing up to HOA overreach. We've helped several other property owners deal with similar situations. Remember that legal aid organization I donated to? They used some of that money to create a handbook about fighting HOA abuse. They named a chapter after my case, The Barn Gambit, Documenting and Defending Against Unauthorized Use. My security system has become a model for other property owners. I've had people from all over the state visit to see my setup. A security company even asked to use my case as an example in their training materials. I said yes, as long as they keep the names private. No need to keep embarrassing Sophia and her crew. They did that well enough on their own. Speaking of Sophia, she finally managed to sell her house last week at a 20% loss. She's moving to Arizona. I heard she's buying a house in an age-restricted community with no HOA. Guess she learned her lesson about property management the hard way. The speed bumps are still there, though I've added solar-powered lights to make them more visible at night. Not that anyone unauthorized tries to park here anymore. The sign at my driveway has become something of a local landmark. People stop to take pictures sometimes. I've expanded my classic car collection now that I know my barn is secure. Added a '65 Shelby Cobra replica that I'm restoring. The monthly property rights meetings in my barn have grown so much we had to start a waiting list. Turns out a lot of people have HOA stories they need to share. The new HOA board has taken a completely different approach to community relations. Instead of trying to control everyone, they focus on actual improvements. They've installed a proper parking lot at the community center, started a neighborhood watch program that respects property lines, and even organized a classic car show where I displayed some of my restorations. Last week they held their first summer block party since the lawsuit. No parking drama, no trespassing, just neighbors having a good time and respecting each other's property. I actually got invited properly with a written invitation. I went for an hour, showed off the Cobra, and had some decent conversations with neighbors who'd moved in after the lawsuit. Some of the original HOA supporters still give me the cold shoulder, but most people have moved on. The new residents are much more respectful of property lines. Amazing how a six-figure judgment and some criminal charges can change the neighborhood culture. The property rights group I host has expanded its mission. We now offer free consultations to people dealing with HOA issues. Last month, we helped an elderly couple stop their HOA from fining them for having a medical ramp installed. The month before, we helped a veteran keep his therapy dog despite HOA pet restrictions. It feels good to help others stand up to unreasonable demands. Jim and I have started documenting these cases for a potential book about property rights and HOA oversight. We're calling it When Good Neighbors Need Good Lawyers. The chapter about my barn case is already written. It's amazing how much material you get from one HOA's complete disregard for property rights. The security cameras have caught some interesting moments over the past few months. My favorite was when a new HOA board member tried to explain to a recent move in why they couldn't use my driveway for overflow parking during a house party. The new resident was pointing at my barn, and the board member just kept shaking his head and pointing at my security cameras. Message received. I've installed a small museum of sorts in one corner of the barn, displaying the original cease and desist letter, court documents, and photos from the case. I call it the Wall of Justice. It's a hit during the classic car shows I host now. People love reading about how a regular property owner stood up to HOA overreach and won. The legal precedent from my case has been cited in 3 other lawsuits against H.O.A.s in our state. 2 of them were settled out of court as soon as the H.O.A.s lawyers realized they were fighting a losing battle. The third went to trial and used our case as a blueprint for documenting violations. They won too. One interesting development: the state legislature is now considering a bill to require H.O.A.s to have written agreements for any use of non-HOA property. They're calling it the Common Sense Property Rights Act, but some people are nicknaming it the Barn Law. Several legislators have reached out to me for testimony about my experience. The security company that documented my setup has installed similar systems for dozens of other property owners dealing with HOA issues. They've started advertising a property rights protection package that includes cameras, speed bumps, and signage. They even offer a discount if you mention my case. My property values have actually gone up since the lawsuit, probably because everyone knows it's well protected now. I've had several offers from developers wanting to buy my land, but I'm not selling. This place means more to me now than ever. The monthly property rights meetings have become a real community hub. We've helped draft legislation, advised on other cases, and created a network of property owners who support each other. It's ironic. The H.O.A.'s attempt to steal my property led to the creation of a group that helps protect other people's property rights. Last week, I got a letter from a law school professor asking permission to use my case in her property law class. She says it's a perfect example of how to document violations and pursue legal remedies. I agreed, on the condition that they also discuss the importance of standing up to bullies who hide behind organizational authority. The whole experience has taught me a lot about standing up for what's right. It would have been easier to give in when they first started using my barn, but that would have just encouraged more bad behavior. Sometimes you have to fight back, document everything, and let the legal system do its job. As for the future, I'm expanding my workshop space, adding more security features, just in case, and continuing to host events for the property rights group. The new H.O.A. seems to have learned its lesson, but I'm keeping the cameras rolling. Trust, but verify, as they say. Sophia's replacement on the H.O.A. board recently admitted that my case was the wake-up call their community needed. They'd gotten so used to pushing people around that they'd forgotten about basic property rights. Now they have proper procedures, transparent finances, and actual respect for property lines. It's nice to see that sometimes justice doesn't just prevail, it changes things for the better. My fight wasn't just about parking or a barn. It was about standing up to entitled people who think rules don't apply to them. And in the end, that's exactly what happened. The end, for real this time.